right, sorry about that. They only let you record for 15 minutes at a time for some reason. Okay, so moving on. Types of peer reviews. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. So there are in-class / online reviews, and it's easy to adapt most in-class review techniques for online courses. So, Zoom, Google Hangouts, Skype, FaceTime, discussion boards, whatever. Or obviously you can do this and it'll work great face-to-face. There are response-centered reviews, and now let's talk about the face-to-face procedure for this. Response-centered reviews focus on just honest reader reactions. So no advice. You're not giving advice. You're not saying, I think you need to do X, Y, or Z. You're just reacting. And then the author has to decide how to use that feedback. Sometimes it's going to be contradictory because writing is subjective. Everybody's different. People are going to have different opinions. One person's going to love this. The other person's going to hate the same thing. It's going to be super frustrating. That's where then you have to communicate to your students that they, as the writer, have to go with their gut and what feels right to them. So, but it's useful to have just those honest, from the gut reader reviews. So the procedure for this is to divide students into groups, 4 or 5 people maximum, and then the students will either read their work out loud, which is my preferred method, or the group can read silently. Everybody brings enough copies for everybody, etc. Everybody reads the paper. And you're going to assign a timekeeper in each group to ensure that each writer gets equal time, because otherwise it's real easy to just end up focusing on one person's paper and then your time's gone. So the procedure for this is students will read the papers. They'll take notes for 5 minutes or so. One good note-taking method that I like a lot is to divide a piece of paper into 3 columns: plus, minus, and question mark. So plus is what's working, minus is what's not working, and question mark is just questions that arise as you're reading the paper. And then group members explain their reactions to the writer one by one. Again, you're not giving advice, you're just saying, well, as I was reading, here's what I was thinking about, or the questions that were coming up. It's not advice, it's just reaction. And the writer will take notes. And the main thing that you need to communicate to students about being the one in the hot seat, as they say, is that your job is not to defend your work or really to engage in any discussion. Your job with a response-centered peer review is just literally to sit there and listen and absorb what readers' reactions to your work have been. And that's it, and take notes. So you're not going to say, well, the reason I did that was because, no, not interested, just listen and take notes. So it's a good thing to provide worksheets, because it always is with peer review. This is a situation where they would exchange drafts before class. The reviews would be homework using that peer review worksheet. So in this case, this is not in-class face-to-face. This is a take-home. So you send them home with that worksheet. Ideally, you'd have 2 reviewers per student, so everybody gets at least 2 different people's responses. And then you can come back as a class and discuss some of the reviews as a class, which is always a good idea. Again, I'm a big proponent of examples and sample papers, and it's not that you say, well, this is exactly the right way to do it and all other ways are wrong, but it's just to kind of demystify the process a little bit and give people an idea of how this works in practice. So that's kind of a take-home version of the same thing. Here's a sample worksheet, and this is from the Bean book, the Engaging Ideas book. So some judgment questions and some descriptive questions. So some judgment questions would be like, does the paper have a purpose statement? Is the purpose clear? Is the paper logically organized? Does the author use evidence effectively to support the argument and main points? Is the paper clearly written? How persuasive is the argument? You'll notice most of those are kind of yes-no questions that don't really encourage a lot of dialogue. It's just kind of like, does it have this? Is it clear? Etc. And you can elaborate on some of these things, obviously, but they'll kind of start with a yes-no response. And then the descriptive questions on the other side, in 1 to 2 sentences, state what position you think the writer is taking. Place stars around the sentence you think presents the purpose or the thesis. I love that one. On the back of this sheet, make an outline of the paper. Oh, such a good exercise. I love outlining already written drafts. It is so helpful to me to take a 15-page paper and outline it into a 3-page outline where you can just so clearly see what the trajectory of ideas from one to the next is. I'm telling you, do it with your own papers. You'll see it's an incredibly effective technique. So next, list the kinds of evidence used to support the writer's argument. Which pieces of evidence do you think are strongest and weakest? highlight in color any passages you had to read more than once to understand. That lets the reader know, oh, there might be something wiggy with the sentence structure here, or there must be something missing. After reading, did you agree or disagree with the writer's position, and why? So those are a lot more open-ended, there's a lot more engagement there between the reviewer and the work that they're reviewing. So I really like those descriptive questions, and those would be great to include on a sample worksheet. But even some of the judgment questions are good too. You could do a mix of the two. So the judgment / descriptive questions produce more useful information for the writer. Like if readers describe your argument and their description of your argument is completely different than what you thought you were arguing, then that's going to tell you, all right, I'm not communicating what I meant to communicate here. Or if they make an outline of the paper and it's totally different than what you thought, your thought trajectory was, then that's going to be very telling. These questions encourage reviewers to engage with ideas. So, did you agree or disagree, and why? And they encourage students to spend a little more time reviewing as well. So this is a great guidance that'll really have them complete every single one of these. It's going to force them to slow down and not rush through the process and not just be tempted to say, oh, it was great, except you put a comma in the wrong place on page 3, which is not constructive, obviously. So next are advice-centered reviews, whereas the response-centered reviews are just honest reactions of readers. These are advice-centered, so they're product-oriented versus response-oriented. And this is where reviewers collaborate to advise the writer. So 2 students will work together to review one student's paper. And the crucial thing here is to make sure the students understand the assignment and any rubrics for the assignment first, okay? Remind them they have to use their best judgment about whether to take the advice. So whatever your reviewing pair says about your paper, if it really just doesn't feel right to you, then it doesn't, that doesn't mean just because they said it that you have to do it. So you have to use your best judgment as a writer. As with pretty much every type of peer review, the students should have the drafts ahead of time so they can read them and then respond carefully. So the procedure for this is to divide the class into pairs. Each pair will exchange drafts with another pair. For odd-numbered classes, you can have one pair exchange with one strong writer if you like. The students in each pair will collaborate to write a review of the 2 drafts they receive, and this should be guided by the rubric. So write out at least 2 things you think are particularly strong about this draft, or identify 2 or 3 aspects of this draft that are currently weak, problematic, or ineffective. So those are just examples of stuff you can put on that rubric. Make 2 or 3 directive statements recommending the most important changes that the writer should make in the next draft, because here we actually are giving advice. So I think you need to do this, this, and this. And then pairs will return the drafts to the authors with their collaborative reviews, and time permitting, the 2 pairs can meet and discuss. And again, this works on Zoom just as well as it works in person. Just make breakout rooms or whatever you got to do. All right, so those are some kind of hands-on methods, and then there are some specific tools available for online peer review. This guy doesn't look real happy about his, but nevertheless. All right, so one thing is the discussion board feature on Canvas. So if you use Canvas in your courses, you can use that feature as well. But like all peer review, if you're going to use a written format like that where there's no face-to-face, that's totally fine, but it should always be guided by the instructor. Don't just say, like, review each other's work and let them go, because it'll be a disaster unless they're very experienced at it. Then there's this thing called Calibrated Peer Review. It's called CPR. It's a free web-based program that enables users to peer review classmates' work with some guidance. Now, the University of Kentucky, where I teach, has a CPR site. There's the link for it right there. If you want to screenshot that, and you just got to log in and follow the instructions. So the way it works is you create an assignment and a list of yes/no questions for the reviewer, and then you provide 3 sample papers: exemplary, middle of the road, and a weak paper to illustrate common problems. You can actually do this if you teach the same class every fall. You can actually, with the papers blinded, of course, and with the student's permission, you can choose real examples from previous semesters where you've taught this course. And then the site is going to store your grading and ranking of those papers. So students upload their papers, and then they have to pass a calibration test based on their reviews of the 3 sample papers. And if they pass that calibration, then they get 3 papers to review. This is completely anonymous and random. so people can be brutally honest, which is always a good thing, right? The site prompts them to score their own essay with the same exact rubric, so it's teaching them to become better self-editors as well. And then finally, they get the reviews for their own paper. And where this seems to be exceptionally effective is in science courses, which is why I bring it up for our nurses, because it seems to work especially well in those sorts of courses as opposed to like social sciences or humanities or something like that. One caveat for this particular tool is that some argue that it's best as a writing to learn tool, like to actually teach subject matter as opposed to learn how to write better. Which I can actually see the value in that statement. I think that could be the case. But others argue that it does promote writing skills. You know, it's something you could just try with one class and see if it benefits people. But the key here, as with pretty much any tool, is you want to use this calibrated peer review with a revision process. You could use it without reading the student's work yourself, but you'd probably want to avoid that because you always want it to be part of the writing/thinking process that you're teaching your students how to do. So I'm not gonna lie, I've never used it. I'm just, saying it's out there. Then there's something called SWORD, which is Scaffolded Writing and Rewriting in the Discipline, which encourages revision of multiple drafts. It was developed by University of Pittsburgh, and they describe it as a web-based reciprocal peer review system that supports writing practice. So that's SWORD. You can check that out as well. Now, I know a lot of us are teaching via Zoom lately because of the pandemic and everything, and sometimes just because we're teaching at online universities and whatnot. So here are some tips for peer review by Zoom. So one good tip is to assign one group member in a peer review group to keep time, just like you would in a face-to-face class. Set a definite time limit for the session. And I think Zoom actually may let you schedule timed breakout rooms where it'll cut you off at a certain time. Students should read each other's work before the session and consider having the students record the session. Then they can play it back later. That can be just worth its weight in gold to have that recording to look at. Here are some good resources if anybody wants to screenshot this for some more tips and tools and peer review. So I'll just leave that up there for a second. Here's some more. Now, the next slide is part of a peer review worksheet that I created myself for a concept analysis that a colleague and I worked on in a nursing theory course a few years ago. This is just real simple, and you can see it just says guidelines for effective feedback. It's kind of almost like Mad Libs here. Ask questions. In many cases, the best feedback you can offer comes in the form of questions. Here are some examples. You don't have to use any of these. I only offer them as a handful of sample questions. Why do you wait until the 4th page to begin talking about blank? What does blank mean in the context of blank? Why is blank important? So you notice those are all kind of open-ended. They're there to encourage critical thinking. And then I also tell them, think about the journalistic questions. So who, what, when, where, how. Those are all nice and open-ended as well and encourage deeper thinking about the subject matter. And then I invite them to show where the writer could provide more information. An effective approach would be to ask for more info and to explain why you think the info would be helpful. So I'd like to know more about blank because blank. So that's just one example. There are so many ways you can do this. That's just one little example that I came up with for one particular assignment. These are some of the sources that I use for this presentation. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope that everybody has a great experience using these techniques in their classes. Certainly let me know if you do or even if you don't.